In this chapter, we're going to start talking about the vertebrates compared to the invertebrates, which we're talking about in the last two chapters. Now we're going to be talking about the vertebrates, which really is most of the animals that we probably are most familiar with because they're the ones that we probably spend the most time around. We're going to look at the four general characteristics of chordates. And the important thing to remember here is that these four characteristics are characteristics that are present at some time during the development. And they may or may not be there the entire time, but they are going to be there at some time during the development of the creatures. Now, because we are chordates, I want to make sure that I make some important points about these, because you will see in some books, on a lot of websites, you'll see that some people will take this and try to turn it into a big evolution discussion when we've already spent a lot of time talking about creation versus evolution. But I'm going to bring out a couple of points here again, just because I don't want you to fall for some of these arguments where people are going to try to convince you that evolution is a fact when what they're saying really doesn't have any basis in fact at all. Okay, so let's talk about the general characteristics of chordates. First of all, they're going to have, again, at some point in their development, a hollow dorsal nerve cord. Now, you'll recall in the last module, we talked about a ventral nerve cord, which is going to be on the underside of the creature, but this is going to be on the dorsal or on the back side. And this dorsal nerve cord will develop into a brain and spinal cord, and then for the animals, for the creatures that end up with a backbone, then the vertebrae are going to come around that in order to protect it. Okay, so that's the first characteristic. Second characteristic is that at some point in their development, they're going to have a notochord. And this notochord may eventually develop into the vertebrae. Now, not all creatures who are chordates are going to have vertebrae. Some of them are going to have a notochord throughout their entire life. In fact, there are 3 subphylums of the chordates, and you can see this example, these different characteristics as we go through these as far as the notochord is concerned. So your subphylum Urochordata, which is where your sea squirts are located, because you're going to read about or have already read about the sea squirts, they have a notochord throughout their larval stage, but it's going to completely disappear in the adult stage. So they have a notochord part of the time, but it's not always there. Okay, then your subphylum Cephalochordata, which is where your lancelets are, which you've read about those, they have a notochord their entire life. They never actually develop a hard backbone, but they do have this notochord their entire life. Now, when you get into subphylum Vertebrata, there is a notochord there during early development, but it turns into a backbone before birth or before the creature hatches. Okay, so as you can see, there's notochords throughout life, notochords for part of a life, notochords that turn into vertebrae before they're actually born, before they actually hatch, either direction, whichever type of creatures you're talking about. Okay, so those are your notochords. They're there at some point. They're not necessarily there for the entire lifespan. Third characteristic, pharyngeal slits. Some places you're going to see them called pharyngeal pouches. Sometimes these pharyngeal slits or pouches are going to turn into gills. And so again, and I think I mentioned this briefly when we were in that chapter on evolution. Some people will look at it and go, oh, well, because we had pharyngeal slits or pharyngeal pouches were in the moon, that's when we were going through our fish stage. No, that's really not what it is at all, because those pharyngeal slits or pouches or folds of tissue don't have anything to do with respiration in humans. In humans, those areas become tonsils, they become your middle ear canals, they become your parathyroid and your thymus glands, and so it doesn't have anything to do with gills. Now, in some creatures, those same areas do turn into gills. In your fish, they do, but not in us. We never had gills. We don't need gills, and those areas in our embryos never has anything to do with respiration to begin with. So yeah, the pouches are there, the slits are there, but they're for completely different purposes and completely different creatures. Okay, The last one, again, all of these are at some point in the development. It says a tail extending past the anus. And I'm sure that you're sitting there thinking, you're telling me I had a tail? I don't have a tail. I never had a tail. Did I? Or did I? No, you never had a tail. You did have an area that extended past the anus that was eventually covered with muscles and surrounded by limbs, but it was not a tail. Basically, all it meant is that the end of your spine was kind of sticking out, and it just wasn't done yet. Psalm 139:16 says, "Your eyes have seen my unformed substance." And so that tail, supposedly, that was extending past the anus, that was just some unformed substance that was there. Eventually, it turns into muscles and legs. I don't even like the fact that it's called a tail, because that's not the vocabulary that we think of as a tail. That's not what this is. Okay, we did not have a tail like a dog has a tail. Like anything else has a tail. Okay, just there was some tissue that was sticking out past the end of the spine that just wasn't completely developed. Okay, so again, these are characteristics that are present in chordates at some point in their life, and sometimes they disappear, sometimes they turn into other things, but all of the chordates are going to have these in common.